It is October 21st, 2025. I am eager to get you right into my first podcast to hear my story and why you should be listening to me, but I felt this is pretty good background. So I gave that date because I filmed this first podcast right around January 21st of this year. So 9 months ago. And I actually left my job last September, so 14 months ago, almost. And I bring that up to say that I have not worked since. And actually, unlike many, I intended the podcast to be my work. I don't exactly expect to get a Joe Rogan deal, but I think, and if you stay with this, it will be good enough, great enough to be on that level. But it all started in September. I already had a marketing guy from my previous job, which I'll talk about, and he had some experience in media as well. So he said, you've got to start filming YouTube videos, just 5-minute YouTube videos in advance of the podcast. Just do 3 to 5 a week. Well, sounded simple enough, right? It's my only job. Couldn't do it. Or if I did, it'd be at the very end of the week. It would be at midnight often. I mean, it was just a disaster. And my marketing guy's name is Henry. And he'd say, Brian, can't you just work 3 hours a day? And I said, absolutely, Henry, I should be able to. But, at the time, I was only probably 6 months or so, I should know this, sober. So I was still, in that early recovery process. I was doing the work, therapy, coaching. I was on sobriety, tons of sobriety calls and sharing. So I really was working. But you'd think I could film those videos, and I could not. And I couldn't start the podcast till I knew I could keep those videos up consistently, because he said even after the podcast, you're going to need to keep those videos up. So it took me till January before I finally filmed my first part 1 and 2 of my intro. The remaining podcast will have guests. And I then started filming the podcast, but had to take a break because I was still not able to consistently film those videos. I was just doing 1 podcast a week at best, but I couldn't even film 5 to 10 minute YouTube videos per week. And I thought, what is wrong with me? All these years I thought it was drinking holding me back. And it just kept going. I finally said, we can't publish the podcast, and I need to join Work Bar, shared office space, where I can go organize my notes, plan my videos, and I just need to be able to live a normal life, just be able to get up, get in my cardio, and eat my 2 to 3 meals a day. I couldn't even do that and take a shower. I couldn't even do any of that efficiently. I was showering, if at all, very end of the day. I'd be eating dinner at 10 o'clock, breakfast at noon. I did do the intermittent fasting. But anyway, so I eventually joined Work Bar, paused the podcast. Still wasn't working out because I couldn't get to Work Bar till mid-afternoon, if at all. So it got really, really frustrating to the point my therapist kept saying, you've got ADHD. And that's what I really want to talk about. This podcast is going to be about sobriety, recovery focused. We're not going to get really that much into people's backstories. We're going to get pretty much right into it and then work into their backstories. But I'm also going to be weaving in ADHD, or ADD as I call it for short. Pretty much every alcoholic I've talked to says they suffer from that as well. And I know they go hand in hand, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that later. So finally, my therapist said, you've got ADHD, to the point I asked my doctor to prescribe me Adderall, which I did get on for a 7-week experiment. And I have more details on this now on my YouTube page, but didn't work out. I then tried to do it alone again for a month or 2 before I finally, there's so many parallels to alcoholism, realized I couldn't do it alone. Ended up shelling out big money for a coach who's got a system, and that's the new work that I've been doing, making very slow progress. But to the point I said, all right, let's launch the podcast. And I have been able to now bang out YouTube videos. I mean, talk about progress. Absolutely bang those out. Oh, and by the way, I was also planning on daily social media videos. A daily short video and a post. Those are easy to do. Just hold up the camera in front of my face, not really rehearsed or not really with notes and too much research. I could whip those off faster, but I still very quickly couldn't keep up doing one video and one additional post per day. So I was struggling with that as well. I can now whip those out, although there's times with my ADD I pull back from doing that or anything. So much more to discuss about that. But what I want you to know is that it's taken 9 months to publish this from the first podcast. And I know I'll be kicking myself. And by the way, I also want you to know I have since evolved that I'm launching my own sobriety recovery community that will also involve ADHD as well. And that should be launched any day. Today is Tuesday. It was going to be launched yesterday. I still wasn't ready. I continually get overwhelmed. ADHD is so misunderstood. It's basically, to me, the quickest way to say it is a complete lack of work ethic due to being in a constant state of overwhelm. And it's something I talk about in terms of trauma, which the alcoholism battle is a form of daily trauma and recovering from that. And you just go into survival mode. And that's all you care about, is surviving the day. And you don't care about your output. And that's what I've been suffering from. So much more to learn. And I plan to become an expert on that to beat this ADD just the same way I beat drinking, which was to do so much research and participate in so much community. As part of that ADD coaching program, there is a community as well. And I'm going to overcome this, and I plan to become an expert on that as well. A budding expert, I should say. Can never become a true one. So I guess I'll end it. There's so much more to say. I hope you'll be patient with the podcast. Each one's going to get better. There's a great book called Level Up by Rob Dial. He says, you want to get great at podcasts? Do 800 of them, just like I did. Same with my YouTubes. I'm up to 100 of those now. First 20 I think are phenomenal. They got a little forced in the middle, but I think there's a ton to learn there. I'm under Sober Cappy, if you don't know, on social media, YouTube. And my community is going to be called LEPT, which stands for Learn, Experiment, Perform, and Thrive, which is something I've done within the sobriety communities with my sharing and has led to accelerating my recovery and my growth. And the website, I'm sure we'll put in the notes. It's ilept.mn.co. That's because I use Mighty Networks as my platform. But that'll be in the notes. But LEPT is the name of it. I hope you'll check that out. It's going to be so fun and so fast. There's going to be so much learning as well as fun. Truly the definition of fun-briety. And I hope you'll check that out. So with no further ado, enjoy. Thanks for tuning in. All right. So who the hell am I? And why should you listen to the Cappy Hour podcast? Well, first off, my name is Brian Capello. Thus, my nickname is Cappy. So couldn't have it named itself, basically. And, I got to do my first podcast with my background, but I'm going to try to get right to the juicy stuff. Most speaker shares tend to give a lot of background, and I think the speakers often thinks it's much more fascinating than it is to the audience in terms of just the initial family background and all that. So I'm going to give it a real abbreviated version of that and get right to the rock bottoms. I got a buddy says, we always talk about dreams, and we talk about, well, everybody says it, nobody cares more about your dreams than you do. So anyway, I grew up in a Irish Catholic family. My mother was Irish as can be. Her mother was a Sullivan, married a Sullivan. And on my father's side, Italian, married an Italian. And I have a brother and sister, both, one's a year older, one's a year younger. And right off the bat, the most fascinating thing and something that really helped me with sobriety is I completely take after my mother, 99% on the Irish side. And all her siblings and her parents, they all had the alcohol gene. And on my siblings take completely after my father's Italian side, and all of them could take it or leave it. That's not a blanket statement on Irish and Italians, but it definitely is in my case. All my Irish cousins, there's 9 of us, and the only 2 without major alcohol problems, that are either in the program or should be, are my brother and sister. And they are the only ones that take after the other side of the family. So, just today I was talking to a guy and he said, how did you get over? He goes, I hate the shame of being an addict. I said, dude, because I've always basically known since I realized I had a drinking issue that mirrored, that side of the family. I've known that this thing is a gene, largely, it's certainly in my case and for the majority. It's not always, but it certainly is for the majority. So, I've known that. What's ironic is growing up, in high school, my father used to drink whiskey sours, and he would give us all sips, and I hated it. I hated alcohol. My brother and sister enjoyed sips of it. And now my sister basically got sick in college once and has barely drank for the rest of her life. She'll have a mudslide now and then. And then my brother is a normal drinker. He's got a fully stocked bar in his house, which is something that those of you with the disorder know we could never have. So, I was a late bloomer in high school. I just didn't fit in. I like to say I had an A personality with a B level confidence and barely dated in high school or college. My parents started me earlier. My birthday's the end of November, but they started me for that year's schooling, which now is cut off on September 1st. So I was always like the little brother, especially in college. And I didn't drink. I didn't drink till 3 months into college. I ran track and cross country in high school. I knew back then apparently that it was poison. And I resisted. I had no interest in drinking. Even though all the cool crowd was out drinking on the 19th hole on golf courses and all that, I had no interest in it. And it's amazing. I made it 3 months into college. First day of college, walked in, people were swilling in my dorm room. They happened to pick my room, and there was already a bunch of guys in there drinking up. And, I'll never forget walking into that room with my parents and then them dropping me off and me thinking, oh my God. And you would think right then, especially knowing what I do now or knowing as it progressed, as a drinker, boy, I would have made things a lot more comfortable if I had just caved then. But no, I made it 3 months because I actually ran for the cross country team. And it wasn't until the season ended that I finally said, all right, it's going to be one or the other. Either I'm going to drink and have a social life, or I'm going to run 12 miles a day for my college career. And I also didn't fit in on that team. I went to Providence, bunch of Irishmen, basically spoke a different language, true Irishmen, right from there. So didn't fit in there either. So, one night I went out to a club and I drank. And I'll never forget the next morning telling some people saying, oh my God, last night was so fun. I was talking to anybody. It was so great. And they looked at me and they said, have you ever drank before? And of course I lied and said, oh yeah, absolutely. But it's funny how vividly I remember that till this day. And I learned right then, and that alcohol could be a social, or I used alcohol from that point on as a social tool for the next 30 years or so. I'm 53 now, by the way, recently turned. Thank you very much. And, the first time I ever did shots, we had a dance freshman year and learned that lesson the hard way, knowing that shots take, a couple minutes to really hit home. So I never got so sick in my life. I still owe a thanks and gratitude to a girl named Sheila Estes from Providence that babysat me while everyone was at the dance that night. She might have left eventually, but she got me over the hard part. And, one quick note is in one of the classes I took in college made us go to an AA meeting. Which ironically, I had no issues back then, but I remember how fascinating it was just to hear other people's stories. But who would have ever known at that point that I myself would attend for my own purposes many years later? Because this is a progressive disorder, as you may or may not know. So, but yeah, I used it as a social tool in college. Got hammered, pretty much every night. Did the Irish exit home every night alone. And, I'll never forget once my roommate, probably middle of the afternoon, came in from a run and he thought I had a glass of iced tea and he took a swig and he spit it out because it had vodka in it. So, but I don't recall doing that on a daily basis, drinking during the day, but definitely at night, every night pretty much that I went out. And I just go from party to party, bar to bar, trying to fit in and, never really worked out. And got out of college. I was working. I went liberal arts, Providence. So I basically had no knowledge, no skills, no resume. So I went back to my job as a waiter at the Radisson Inn Sea Garden Grill restaurant at the Radisson Inn, Marlborough, Massachusetts. And I was a waiter. And my buddy called me one night and he said, hey, let's go into the Harp in Boston, near the Boston Garden. And he said, yeah, why don't you pick me and my sister and a friend up when you get out of work? So I still never forget this either. I had to beg a guy to cover for me, and so I could get out of there early, picked them up, went in, did my usual thing, right? Drinking heavily so that I could dance. Heaven forbid I dance sober. So I was drinking heavily. Then I would usually sober up for the drive home. But very early into that night, my friend's sister, her friend, got sick, started throwing up. The next thing I knew, they said, we have to leave. She's sick. I was like, all right. So went with my friend's sister to get the car. That plays a pivotal part of the story. I went back to the bar, picked up my buddy and the girl that was sick, and drove home. It was about a 40-minute drive, much of it on the highway, the Massachusetts Turnpike. And because my buddy's sister was in the front seat, she kept saying to me, pull over, I'm going to get sick. And, if my buddy was in the front seat, I'm sure he would have just said, throw up on the floor, do whatever you got to do. We can't pull over. But yeah, I pulled over within eye distance of a cop that was on a traffic detail. But I figured he was busy with that detail. But no, it was within minutes. Probably also because a girl was out of the car throwing up, that he pulled up behind us. And the next thing I knew, I was doing a field sobriety test. And the next thing I knew, I was in the back of a cop car. I still remember it. Drunk as I might have been. I don't think I was insanely, but those handcuffs were so tight. I can still remember trying to guilt the cop, saying, you must have a son or daughter. What if this happened to them? Basically let me off. I was like, yeah, fat chance. And then I remember sucking on quarters. I must have in my pocket for whatever reason, in anticipation of taking a field sobriety test back at the station. I don't know. I guess they didn't have them, back then. This was in, must have been in 1994, 95. Should have looked that up. And they, in the end, I'm pretty sure I refused to take it, actually. But I still remember sucking on quarters, thinking that would help for some reason with my blood alcohol level. But spent the night in jail. My buddy Todd picked me up the next day. Thank you very much. And went to court that day. Still remember going to court in Boston. Ran into a girl I went to college with named Andrea. Hey. And got away with not telling my parents. Amazingly enough, I was still living at home. I eventually pled nolo contendere, I think it's called. And as long as you don't have any incidents for the next year or whatever, it got wiped off your resume. They said the judge I got was like Santa Claus, they call them. So I got very lucky. And I went to drunk school. The thing I remember about that, I'll never forget, is there was a guy in there that was at home drinking, but his girlfriend needed him to move his car. He was blocking her in. He backed out of his driveway, and someone drove into him. Not sure who was at fault, but either way, they determined he'd been drinking, and he got a DUI, basically in his own driveway. So I went to drunk school every Wednesday night for many weeks. I remember having dinner with my family. I think the school was, 6:30, 7 o'clock. And then every week making up some excuse that I had to go out. And it wasn't until my parents went to renew their homeowner's insurance that they're apparently informed that you've got someone living with you that had a DUI, and that somehow impacted their ability to renew. So they sat me down, confronted me. I remember it was a pretty teary situation. It was kind of innocent enough, but I don't think I even explained the whole situation. But that was kind of the first opportunity probably for them to, explain it, ran the family and how alcoholism worked and all that. But that really didn't come from that discussion, and I don't remember much else really coming from it. But that was my first incident. The next big one, I got many stories in between, but again, I want to get right to the gossip. In 2007, so since then I went on. I actually married my first long-term girlfriend. I knew we didn't have chemistry. I guess I'll quickly tell that before my next incident. But I knew we didn't have great physical chemistry, but we lived about an hour apart, never really spent nights together. And I thought, well, when we get married, I'll just drink when I want to be intimate with her. She's my best friend. That's 98% of the time you spend together. So yeah, I'll just drink when I want to be intimate. Well, I quickly learned that's not how it works. You might think drinking always, especially when you're young, made you in the mood. Well, if you're not really into the person physically, just kind of makes you want to sleep. So yeah, it was only a short-term marriage, and because we were like roommates. I think very common first marriage situation. And eventually said, before we had kids, I said, I don't think we're going to make it due to this chemistry thing, and I didn't want to go have kids and then cheat on her, etc., like many do. So yeah, we got separated, divorced after just a couple years, and I got on the dating websites, and that started a whole pre-drinking cycle, and eventually moved into Boston, where I didn't have to worry about driving. Pre-drank before every date, drank like a maniac. I'd start doing shots. I'd do a shot just before I got into the shower. Then when I got out of the shower, I had a big issue with my hair growing up. I had this big kind of afro type of pubic head, but I would never let my barber kind of cut it because I thought I had big ears. All because a kid in my neighborhood, anytime I got a haircut, he'd say, oh, did you get your ears lowered? Which is just a stupid joke people use on anybody, but I took it personally. And so I had this hair complex going back, just where I looked in the mirror and thought I was this ugly kid with this big features and ugly hair that I used to work on for a half hour before I could ever leave the house. So it wasn't until I was in college that a friend just basically forced me to a buzz cut, and never got so many compliments in my life. But my point was, I hated looking in the mirror, even doing my hair, even after I basically got it under control. To this day, I still see that 16-year-old kid in the mirror that so struggled with that problem. So I would do shots before every date, ran into a major pre-drinking problem. And anyway, so in 2007, speaking of pre-drinking, I had to give my great aunt's eulogy. She was basically like a grandmother to me. And I originally just thought I must have been doing shots in the parking lot, but talked to a relative recently who claims she even saw me at my parents' house before we went to the church and could smell alcohol on me. So perhaps even on the drive there at probably 8:30 in the morning, I was already, doing some sipping of some kind of hard alcohol. But I'm sure I was doing, once we got there, doing a couple shots in the parking lot. And, and the irony is all you ever need would be one shot, but that's not how this disorder works. It's just, you blow right through that good buzz and you just keep on drinking. But it's for another day. So the last thing I remember was being up on the altar, not speaking for long, and apparently got dragged off the altar. And the next thing I remembered was waking up in the parking lot of the Chateau in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is a restaurant where we had the after gathering for the funeral. And apparently my cousin Jackie, thanks to her, had driven my car there. And I woke up in the passenger seat with everyone inside the after gathering. Apparently where my mother read the beautiful eulogy that I had typed up. And eventually they must have come out. That part I'm a little hazy on, but they must have come out and got my keys and driven home. But even then, so that was another major opportunity to kind of talk about alcoholism of the family and that I clearly have some kind of problem. But again, it didn't happen. I heard rumors that my aunt thought I was on drugs or something like that. But yeah, and I heard of a relative that did try to talk about it with my parents, but I don't know, they just didn't want to address the issue or just said, nah, it's not bad of a thing. But in fairness, we also have a great way of hiding those things. So you think that could have and would have been a rock bottom, but I just continued on from there. And it wasn't till 2014, August of 2014, that I had signed up to take my niece to a One Direction concert. She and I was very tight with both my niece and nephew. I never remarried, never had kids. Drinking was definitely part of that issue with finding my person, so it was never even a consideration. I did have a couple long-term girlfriends that lived with me, but never found that right one. And but I was very close with my niece and nephew, so I think my niece was around 11 years old and loved One Direction, so I signed up to take her. I had no intention of drinking that day. My brother-in-law brought her into Boston after work, and he even left work early, dropped her off early because we want to beat the traffic because concert was out at Foxborough Stadium where the New England Patriots play out in the burbs. And I had no intention of drinking, but of course, like anyone under the brainwashing of active drinking that has the disorder, I said, just in case, I'm going to bring a little water bottle full of vodka. And I brought what I thought, I filled up a little water bottle that I'd gotten from Porter Airlines. It's a Canadian airline. I used to cover them for IBM. And I thought it was as small as the little Polar Spring water bottles you see that I should have looked up, but maybe 6 ounces or so. It wasn't until later I found it was a much bigger bottle than it looked. It was very wide, and I bet that thing held a good 12 ounces or so. So I had filled that with vodka just in case. Figured there'd be all kinds of screaming girls at this concert. And there was a warm-up act, 5 Seconds of Summer, I think they were called. And so I knew I was going to be there for a while. So, what the hell, just in case, a little bit of lubrication. So because we had to get there early, we went to a bowling alley prior to the concert right on the site. And I had a couple beers there. And then during the concert, sure enough, I'm sure that the couple beers accelerated the amount I drank. If I had waited, as often the case, if you don't pre-drink always just made my drinking worse because I just blew through the good buzz. And as I say now, it just, after 20 minutes, you're in buzz limbo. You're just chasing a bad buzz until you drink so much that you go on autopilot, and that's when the bad things happen. And that was certainly the case here. So I drank throughout that concert, sipped throughout that concert, but it was a long enough show, and sadly, I even liked One Direction, but I don't remember a lot of that show, and that could have been such an amazing experience with my niece. I sipped it throughout the show. As we were leaving, it was so loud, I didn't really have my wits about me. I didn't really, I couldn't really calculate how I was truly feeling in terms of the intoxication level. And where all the parking was, you basically had to cross Route 1, which was essentially, I guess you call it a divided highway. And there were state troopers holding traffic off. And unbelievably, I tripped and fell right in front of a statey. And he saw me with my niece and he immediately said, how's she getting home? And unbelievably, I said, oh, my sister's picking her up. Yeah, I'm not driving. I don't have keys on me. And he said, prove it. Call your sister right now. And the crazy part is, rather than confessing at that point, I don't know what would have happened if I did, but I was in such a ridiculous state of mind, I actually called my sister on my cell phone and asked her to lie to the statey to tell him that she was picking us up so that I could then, clearly intoxicated, drive my niece home, or actually to my mother's house. The plan was to go to my parents' house and stay over and have breakfast the next morning, which also would have been a phenomenal bonding experience. Of course, my sister could tell I was intoxicated. I will never forget hearing my brother-in-law screaming in the background, screaming. I'm sure he felt some level of, extra anger because he was the one that dropped her off in my care and trusted me. I'm not sure what my family really knew other than that eulogy scenario, what they really knew about my drinking issues, because, I lived in Boston, and I never drank around my family. I will say that. I was very lucky to have a family that did not trigger me to drink. That was the only time I didn't drink, Lord knows, was when I'd go to visit or stay with my family, amazingly. But I always knew that was my solace. So then from there that night, I was put into protective custody. I'll never forget when they emptied my pockets, I did have my car key in there. I had left my fob and everything else under my wheel well, I guess because I just didn't want to fill I think I had shorts on, obviously, in August. So the cop was so mad. He was like, what's this? Thought you didn't have your keys on you. And he was so mad. But we got separated. I got put into protective custody, which is basically the same thing as being arrested, except luckily without all the legal stuff. And they basically just lock you up till you sober up, and then they let you go. But my poor niece, I later found out, was also brought back to the police station. Fascinatingly, she was given a stuffed animal that was provided by a charity that I was heavily involved in. This girl I knew from Boston ran this charity that gave stuffed animals to police and fire departments to give to, distressed children. And I did a few date auctions for her and totally supported her charity. I wish I could think of the name right now. I should have prepared that. But I was actually kind of heartened to know afterwards that, and this wasn't until years later that I even asked my niece about it, and she told me that. And I think she told me she watched some TV, and very luckily the wife of one of my sister's neighbors, basically, who happened to be the wife of a state trooper, was also at that show, and they were to contact her, amazingly enough, and she actually picked my niece up at the station that night. Now, to this day, I'd like to think I wouldn't have driven with my niece. I'd like to think we would have got back to the car. I would have realized I was in no shape to be driving, especially because I would have known I would have had to, go back and see my parents. So I do not know. I do know a girl that I went to high school with. I know was at that show. Her daughters were there. She was going to be dropping them off and just hanging out in the area. I'd love to think I would have contacted her through Facebook and asked her to give her a ride or give potentially us a ride home. I don't know. That's almost my only solace to this day is nobody can say for sure I would have driven with my niece. That's no excuse. It's deplorable. It's sickening what I did. But I've since learned that's how crazy this disease is and this disorder. Now, I talked about that on my YouTube videos, which if you haven't seen those, under Sober Cappy. But anyway, the next day was horrible. My parents did have a call with them. They were absolutely livid. I think I drank to even get through that call, but I vowed I was going to quit drinking, get some help. And I think after that day, I did not drink for maybe the next week or two, when that pain is so fresh in your memory. But I did return to drinking. And it wasn't until almost a year later that I had what I thought was a kidney stone, which I had had before. I had this tremendous pain in the kidney type of area, and then it was eventually in the groin area, the point on my bladder where I always thought I had to go to the bathroom, and I was like, oh man, this is brutal. But I had a pretty high pain tolerance, and then even one day it seemed to disappear to the point I went to the gym, thought it was totally fine, but then it came roaring back. I remember taking hot baths every night. It was the only time I could get over the pain, but I sucked it up for many days before I finally, once at 6 a.m. in the morning, drove myself to the hospital, said, I think I've just got this kidney stone that won't pass. And it was amazing. This nurse practitioner said, what you're describing sounds more to me like diverticulitis. And it turned out she was right. It's a intestinal infection, essentially where you get pockets in your colon. Initially, they're pockets, and then as it worsens, they burst. And it's almost like you get sewerage going into your system. And that was putting pressure on my bladder. And that's why I was in so much pain. They put me on, heavy antibiotics, but they said it would take 24 hours for the pain to be relieved. And I believe they said nothing would work in terms of morphine or anything. I was later given morphine for a kidney stone, I believe it was, and that completely relieved the pain. But I was in severe, severe pain for at least, I was in pain that whole week. But even that first night, until those antibiotics kicked in, I was in so much pain. I'm a little murky about the fact that why morphine or something couldn't address it. But anyway, that whole week I was in such pain. I remember being in pain in the hospital. And, I was on heavy antibiotics. They swore me up and down. You cannot drink while on these antibiotics. And I also said, I never want to, the diverticulitis had nothing to do with drinking, but I said, I never want to put myself in that kind of pain again. And, put myself in that pain, i.e. by drinking with a hangover, etc. And, those two things, between having to not drink because of the antibiotics and that thought, was enough to break the cycle. I remember even while I was in the hospital, going out, sneaking out for ice cream with a couple of my friends. They were already in the AA program. They were very helpful. They got me going to AA meetings, and which wasn't really for me. So I started going to Smart Recovery, which is kind of a non-religious based recovery program. And that really helped me through the early days. But then it was actually a neighbor of mine. We had a tandem parking spot where two spots, but you had to share keys because one would block the other. And he told me he'd been sober for 8 years and doing it on his own. And I'm very open to suggestion. And I said, if he can do it, I can do it. And I also, I found AA meetings and even Smart Recovery fascinating, but I didn't like taking the time to go. So I said, I'm not going to drink so I don't have to go to meetings. And right then and there, I quit cold turkey, and I was in sales. I got out of sales. I went out and got my Salesforce.com certification so I could be a Salesforce.com administrator. I got a job in that space. I ended up with a girlfriend. Was a lawyer, amazing woman. We'd go to Bikram, hot yoga, 3-4 times a week. We'd go out for smoothies. We lived a very mundane existence, but it was great. We'd watch Netflix. It was awesome. And we eventually broke up after a couple years. I went back to dating, but I did it no problem. What I used to have to pre-drink for, to overcome the awkwardness, etc., I dated no problem. And I made it for 3.5 years. And it wasn't until October of 2018. Let me check that date. October of 2018 that I returned to drinking. And before I tell you that, I'll quickly say that, when I got that Salesforce.com administrator job, it was very much over my head. It was a very well-paying job. I happen to know the director of HR, but I think more I talked myself into the job with my sober confidence. But I'll tell you, that job was so over my head. If I had still been in the throes of drinking, I would have got up every day and been drinking for that job. I had a very tough, control freak boss, and I would have been drinking every day to get through that job, and it would not have gone well. And in case people don't realize, people with the disorder, alcoholics, i.e. alcohol use disorder, it's a survival mechanism. We'll drink at any time of day. I had a boss I hated once, and I would wake up and drink at 7 a.m. just with the thought of going into the office. And thankfully I left that job as well, but would drink all day at that job. And many jobs as well, but stories for another day. So bottom line, in October of 2018, when I've been sober 3.5 years, I went on a date with this beautiful woman that was 5'10", black woman. I'm only 5'8", soaking wet. And, I said to her, why would you want to go out with a shorter white guy? And I'll never forget her saying, hey, I love being the center of attention. And I said, hey, all good. So, I got through all the typical awkwardness of her coming to my place, driving to my place, meeting up with her in my alley, having to get an Uber, going to a nice restaurant, getting through a dinner. But I would tell people different stories based on how long I thought the relationship was going to last. And I told her, I thought this would be a short-term thing. So I didn't get into the whole story. And I told her I quit for the golf season. And she said, well, golf season's basically over in New England, from Boston. If you couldn't tell, I tend to disguise my accent, but people say, yeah, we can tell. And she said, yeah, well, you can drink now. Well, I still made it through that whole dinner, but she was into EDM, electronic dance music, dragged me to an EDM club after. I think I still would have been fine there, but it was already in the back of my mind because I did it alone, I hadn't been doing the work, to achieve emotional sobriety, which I've since defined, they say it's living life on life's terms and doing all the work and therapy, coaching, sharing. But I later defined as permission to enjoy life sober. And I didn't really have that. In fact, when I broke up with the lawyer that lived with me, I dated another lawyer who was an amazing, amazing woman. But we lived it was a pretty mundane, she didn't live with me. Our dating life was pretty mundane. She'd come to my house, I'd go to her house, we'd go to the movies, we'd go out for a drink after. I drink, non-alcoholic beer. She'd have one drink. She was always kind of disappointed I didn't drink it. I didn't really understand why, but I do now. I was never that fun, and I'm a fun guy. I'm a funny guy. But I never felt that permission to enjoy life sober. So it was in the back of my mind. I had said, I'd rather end up in a gutter than continue this mundane existence. So that night, her name was Gloria, I did a couple shots at this EDM club. And I'll still never forget. She towered over me at this club. She basically was wearing a bra. She had big boobs, this beautiful model of a body. And it didn't even throw me at all that people would have been looking at us like, what's she doing with him? I had sober confidence like you read about. I even got to remind myself of that now. And, but I did a couple shots that night. Probably, I describe them as a couple woo-woo shots because I don't think they were that strong, but I had a great buzz like you normal drinkers probably have had your whole life. But yeah, we with the disorder, we process alcohol differently. Stories for later, and I've also talked about in my YouTube videos, Sober Cappy. But never forget, we went home that night. It was phenomenal. She stuck around for a little while, and it was incredible. And that week, I'll never forget, I went to my friend Liz, a realtor. We went to a realty event of hers. I might have pre-drank maybe one beer, if at all. But then I just milked a couple beers at her event and had a great buzz the whole time. I was like, oh my God. Basically the reason I drank, by the way, went back to drinking is because I thought I'd learned every lesson and I could drink normally. Besides the mundane thing, I thought, hey, maybe I can drink normally now. I'll appreciate it. And so, the good news was I could drink normally. The bad news was not for long. Probably within a week, I was back to my old habits. I met that same woman, Gloria, at a bar. I'll never forget. It was around Halloween. We were sitting in this bar, and I had already pre-drank a decent amount, and she wanted to drag me to another EDM club, unbelievably enough, and I was completely obstinate and started a fight, and, she basically wasn't into kissing. I'll just tell you that. And she said, don't ask me about it. The more you ask me about it, the less I'm going to even consider doing it. Well, guess what? I asked her about it that night at the bar. I drilled her on it. The bar was Lear, by the way, for those who remember that in Boston. And I drilled her on it. And she was not happy. And we left separately and never saw her again. And want to shoot myself to this day over that. But yeah, I went home because at that point, when you get that bad of a buzz, I was right back to where I was. And that's the thing about this disorder. When you pick back up, you return right. Well, maybe it took a week, but you eventually turn right back to where you were. It's a progressive disease. They say it even progresses while you're in your sobriety phase, and you return right to where you were when you quit drinking. So I was right back to all I ever wanted to do when I blew through that bad buzz. I was in that, when I blow through the good buzz, and I'd be in buzz limbo, and then just kept drinking until I either stayed in the limbo or got on autopilot. But either way, all I wanted to do was go home and go to bed. That's what I did for the majority of my existence in Boston, especially once I returned to drinking, go out with my friends. I felt I needed to, I went right back to the pre-drinking, had to drink to motivate myself to go out, usually because I was hungover from the day before, of course, and it was miserable. And I would do the Irish exit every single night, never would meet anybody, only would talk to my friends. You'd think you're drinking to go out and be social, meet people, but no, it worked the other way. You drank for courage? No. It made me completely the other way. It made me a total wimp. And I'd go home alone every night. And those were mainly the years leading up to when I quit for 3.5 years. And then again, once I picked back up after those 3.5 years, all my friends that were single, during those years, most of them had gone off and gotten married and moved out of the city. So, I basically was, I did still have some friends in the city, but for the most part, I was just on every dating app. I lived right in the heart of Boston, in the Back Bay near the Prudential Center. So dates would just come to me, come to my place, and we just go out from there. So I'd be back to getting hammered every night. And I did that for the next many, many years. It's been now over 6 years. It was 6 years this past October. I'm recording this in January of 25. So it was 6 years this past October. So it's been, 6 years and change since I picked up drinking again. And I like to say, for the most part, it was about 5 years of hell. And before, I really got committed to getting sober again. And, what really, and what led to that, basically I was living in the city. I got an offer I couldn't refuse on my condo. An old man basically bought the building. There were 6 units. His purchase came with 4 of them, and he eventually bought me out. I moved to the suburbs, Natick, Massachusetts, and decided I was sick of staring at my computer all day. I'd gone back to sales, so I was drinking like a fish. And I said, I want to do something different. And I was working out of Wegmans, this big grocery superstore, and I said, this looks like a fun place to work. I'm going to apply to work at Wegmans, be a department supervisor. Guess what? I didn't even make it through the phone screen with some kid who must have shot me down because I didn't have recent managerial experience. And so I said, all right, I got to do something else. Well, I ended up buying my favorite pizza joint down the street because the owner was so frantic that I offered to help the guy do social media and do some hiring. And the next thing I knew, he just wanted to get out cheap, and I bought the place. And let me tell you, as a perfectionist and people pleaser, don't buy a pizza joint, and especially don't buy one 50 yards from a liquor store. So I got into some horrible habits that led me to drinking every day. I bought it right before COVID, which COVID was actually great for the pizza and the Chinese food business. So we used to get slammed every night with business, particularly on the weekends. Friday nights, I'll never forget the end of the night. I'd be helping wash dishes, literally bawling at the sink. And I do the dishes, one, to help my staff, but also so people couldn't even see me. But I would be just bawling every single night. And I did that for almost 3 years. And one night I decided I was going to drink my face off. Like they say, parents, I don't know if it's really true or an urban legend, but, if your kid wants to smoke, they used to say, have them smoke so many cigarettes, they never want to smoke again. Well, I decided I was going to drink so much that night, I was never going to want to drink again. And I used to never really get sick or that bad physically hungover. Mentally, it was horrible. And it's a big reason I want to quit, because I was haunted by my potential and knew I could never reach it by drinking. But that night, and I used to pound water. I developed a total OCD with water. I would do, glass of water for every drink. And I've never got so sick as I did that night. 3 a.m. I can remember it like it was yesterday, being on, in the floor of my bathroom, praying to the porcelain god. Stupid cliche, but it was true. I was throwing up like a madman, and it was Halloween. That was 3 a.m. Halloween was a Monday morning, and I'll never forget getting a text from my mother saying, "Oh, I'm going to come over, and I'm in the area. I'm coming by to see your sister, whose office I rented a condo from a complex my sister ran." And my mother said she was going to swing by to say hello. Couldn't say no. Well, my mother and sister show up at my door, and I never looked so bad. I looked like hell. My mother broke down like you've never seen. It was awful. She was frantic. I mean, I looked like death. I literally looked like death. Unbelievable timing. What are the odds? The night that I said I was going to drink myself into never wanting to drink again, which, by the way, I'm sure I would have anyway, but was the day or the morning that my mother and sister showed up, basically have an intervention at my door. And the reason was my sister, her maintenance guys knew a lot of people in town. And one of them reported to her that I was slurring at the front desk. I don't think that night before, probably just, in the days before, etc. But it was that morning that they decided to call me on it. And as I like to say or sing, my mother tried to make me go to rehab, but I said no. All I wanted to do was get them out of my place. I promised her I was going to call some rehab places, get some help, but I just wanted them out. It was awful. And eventually, they did agree and they did leave. I'll never forget, I called my friend Amy, who was one of the friends back in the day that helped me when I was in the hospital and got me to AA meetings and Smart Recovery and was a confidant. And I called her, as well as I called my good friend Hope, who used to be a sales colleague who converted to a life coach. And so the two of them really helped me out. And it was Amy that had recommended a sober community. She had told me about before, and even during COVID, I had gotten on some AA Zoom calls. But again, it really wasn't for me. I didn't really speak on the calls, or if I did, I think it was when I'd be tipsy. But I got out of that practice, and I guess this was still even during COVID, later COVID. But so Amy recommended an online sobriety community, and I joined the next day. And essentially, it was all downhill from there. So that was, 2 years and change ago. So I'm going to pick up on everything from there, I guess, in part 2. And then we're going to get to the real podcast, the Real Cappy Hour podcast, which will include guests and great banter and fun questions and answers and dialogue. And it's going to be fantastic. And the reason I did it, by the way, is through this whole process, I've developed that I've learned that I have a bit of a gift to speak in the space, to take what I've learned about sobriety. I can read almost anything and kind of translate it for the common man and make it inspirational, if I do say so. And I'm going to explain where I discovered that gift, all in part 2, coming up next. And as always, if you enjoyed, please like, share, subscribe, what have you. And remember, stronger, sober. Thanks.